Today on Now and Zen, we have Aaron Myers-Brooks here to talk about his new album, Oblique, featuring 17-tone, equal-tempered electric guitar, as well as electronics and other microtonal tuning systems. So glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, there's a lot of questions I have about this album, because I see that there are some pieces that use electronic influences, and I was wondering what sorts of softwares you would use to achieve these kinds of sounds. I know it's written that you use, I think, Ableton, right, in energy shapes, and then you also have the highC miniatures. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background into how you would set something up on your computer using those to get them to play this music.
Yeah, so most of the electronic stuff was done in Ableton, and the kind of synthesizer sounds were all done in FM8, which is a software FM synthesizer that I think is really cool and I've been working with for several years. And it's microtunable in the sense that you can take a 12-note scale and then adjust the 12 notes up or down by a certain amount of cents. There was also various kind of effects processing in that energy shapes piece, so I used like a beat repeat effect and a saturator effect and a grain delay, a few other things as well. And they were all sort of automated so that the processing kind of changes and morphs over time. And then highC is a piece of software that's based around the composer Xenakis's UPick system, which was created several decades ago, if not more at this point. And so it's a music drawing program. So you draw into it, not entirely in a way that's dissimilar from like MS Paint or something, but then according to a certain set of rules, it interprets your digital drawings into sound. And by default, it's not snapped to any kind of pitch grid. So with that set of compositions, it's all kind of freely microtonal, whereas everything else is specifically in 17 equal divisions.
Yeah. So that's so then in highC, if you're drawing that stuff, are you almost like, when you have the drawing screen, is the vertical y-axis pitch and like the vertical x-axis time, and so you're just kind of drawing the pitch shapes?
Exactly, yeah. So in that sense, it's not like totally dissimilar from traditional music notation. But then like you can connect the different images in different ways. So you can like, take one swirly line that you've drawn, and it might be in one color because it's one type of oscillator, and then another line going another direction that's another color because it's another type of oscillator. And then you can actually draw lines between them that connect them through either frequency modulation or amplitude modulation. Then it creates these like cool visual lines between them, but also like has the different sounds modulate each other. So, it works in a fairly specific way, but like within that, there's a lot that you can create both visually and sonically.
Yeah, it seems like it would be a really novel workflow for exploring how to create these sorts of compositions or how to sort of start something from scratch. Like, it feels like a really fresh way of looking at things. I definitely noticed when I listened to those pieces, and the materials that informed them seemed fairly like, elementary, like sine waves and sawtooth waves and things like that. Is there any way to connect that highC software to something like a synth to get it to do those sorts of gestures with different synthesizers? Or like, what kinds of waveforms are you synthesizing and dealing with in that software?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a way to like connect it to external software or not, but it's actually pretty flexible. There's a bunch of different waveforms. So you got your basic like sine, square, sawtooth, stuff like that. There's more complex waveforms, and it also has a lot of built-in samples. So like there's samples of clarinets or whatever. I mostly just stuck to the basic waveforms, although there is one, I think it's called Chitter. That one uses like a percussion sample and has a slightly different sound because of it. But I think you can also bring in your own samples as well. And there's other people that have done more kind of sample-based stuff using it, but I kind of chose to use it more as a synthesizer.
Like, when you were making the highC miniatures, were you thinking of any specific intervals at all, or was it all just completely gestural? Was there any time where you were like, oh, I need a major third here? Or you just kind of
no, it was really purely visual. So it's very different than the rest of the album in that sense.
Personally, a bias of my own is I wish for more types of music where people would combine that sort of writing that's like very instinctual, visually high and low, forgiving in terms of intervals and based on gestures. I wish that was sort of combined more with systems where like you're concerned with what the intervals are and their relationships. So there was sort of more of a mixture of those. It seems like it's kind of a polarizing aesthetic thing in music almost.
Yeah, I guess so. I think folks tend to kind of go to one extreme or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did you use Ableton in the energy shapes to get different textures? Because I was really pleasantly surprised by how the effects really changed each movement and kind of
Oh
made it
yeah.
its own. Like I was almost kind of expecting it to sound like just guitar sounds. And I mean, it does sound like it's coming from guitar, but there's also lots of other electronic influences.
Yeah, so a lot of it is effects automation, so whereas if you're doing a kind of traditional guitar performance, you might have a distortion pedal and you can turn it on and off with your foot, but it's relatively hard to like make a continuous change in say the amount of distortion without you maybe having an extra person that has to turn the knob.
Yeah.
So there's basically a lot of like automation curves written into Ableton that say like, oh, increase the distortion for this moment or change the speed of the delay at this particular moment. And then you just kind of play the guitar into that session with the automation going, and then it creates these changes over time. So yeah, so there's a few different effects: saturation, distortion, beat repeat, grain delay, regular delay, and then there's also this extra like FM synthesizer layer as well. So I kind of said that it's like a trio because it's guitar, effects processing, and synthesizer.
How feasible would it be to play energy shapes live?
I think it's possible. I mean, basically, I would hook the guitar up to the computer and then probably sort of visually follow along with the playback head
Right. You'd
as
have to kind of
is.
see what the effects were doing in order to calibrate yourself correctly.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the movements, like the one called chop and desync, they were kind of designed to be a little flexible. So if each performance is a little bit different in terms of how the effects unfold, that's okay. And then the second and fifth movements have pretty like distinctive rhythms in the synthesizer part that I would hope one could follow along with. I actually have played two movements of it live. I played Oblique and Desync, but I did them a little bit differently. I just sort of did them with like a preset backing track, and then I just did the effects more traditionally with a pedal board. So they came across a little bit differently than they do on the album because of that. But I think if I was to ever perform the entire piece, I'd want to actually play it into Ableton so it's more close to the recording.
Is the main difference between using the effects pedal and using the effects in Ableton just that continuity you mentioned earlier, where like it's on off versus going from one to the other with some sort of gradation?
Exactly, yeah.
Have you played any of the other pieces live, like the solo pieces for guitar?
I have played the Sonata, the solo sonata for 17 tone guitar. I've actually performed that one twice. So it was premiered at the 2020 Beyond Microtonal Music Festival in Pittsburgh. And then I played it a second time at the Pittsburgh Experimental Guitar Night earlier this year. So it had two performances 2 years apart, just about. The other solo piece, that was more of a kind of pandemic recording project. So I wrote and recorded that like right at the beginning of the shutdowns, and then I got reamped and mixed by Colin Marston in New York. That one I've not tried to perform yet. It should be doable. I just haven't dug into trying to learn it in that sense. Yeah, and then the piano and guitar one I think should be playable if I was to find a pianist to want to play the piano part, but I haven't made the attempt yet. Yeah, it mostly should be pretty doable. The energy shapes would be the hardest one to do live because the tech setup's a little more complicated, but I think it's still possible.
I'm really fascinated by the pitch language you use in the album. I'm wondering if you have any tips or tricks for eschewing tonality, or if there's a particular way you think about it that can be manifested as a methodology that would inform your process.
Well, it's mostly pretty intuitive. I think particularly with guitar, because guitar is such a physically kind of specific instrument. most of the music was written at the guitar, and so a lot of it came down to kind of physical shapes that I ended up liking the sound of, whether they're kind of linear melodic shapes playing with the kind of hyperchromatic aspect of having the extra frets, or like ergonomic chords that had a sound that I liked. The one exception to that was the first movement of the Sonata. That one I did actually write out on paper ahead of time. And I didn't have any super specific system, but I did try to kind of frequently rotate between kind of more familiar intervals and then with a more unusual kind of quasi-quarter tone intervals to make it sort of saturated with the more unusual sounds. But, you know, I've spent a lot of time listening to different, like, 12-tone composers, and I've written some music that used, like, tone rows or that used, like, complementary hexachords and stuff like that in the past. So even though there's not a lot of those kinds of systems on this album, I think just having the experience of digging into those styles and working methods has kind of just informed the sounds that I intuitively go for at this point if I'm trying to write more atonal stuff.
I can definitely tell that within the pitch material, there's kind of a back and forth at a lot of points, sort of a tug of war between familiar intervals and unfamiliar ones, which I think is really distinctive about your work. In particular, cool. Prelude and Entity has that, I don't know, it almost has like, you have the fourths and fifths going on. Mm-hmm. And then that's a very traditional relationship. But then when you go from one chord to another chord, you'd feature like neutral seconds in the movement, and so the horizontal relationship is then harmonic, but the vertical relationship is not. I really like that approach.
Cool, yeah, thank you. So with that one, it starts off just purely in A minor.
Yeah.
The 17-tone equivalent, and my goal was to sort of more gradually introduce the more unusual aspects of the sound. Yeah. And yeah, as you say, like having more conventional chords that are moved from one to the next in an unusual way is one way to do that, and then by the end of the piece, it's back to the kind of non-tonal language.
I really admire your patience in introducing those, because you hang out in those conventional sounds, I think, in the texture for quite a long time in the piece, and then you have sort of this, not a phi moment, I guess, but like, this moment where something happens and you kind of hear it, and then you realize you're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah, thank you. It also breaks apart rhythmically at that point, so it switches from being these kind of pulsing polyrhythm things to being very free rhythmically at the moment where it becomes sort of maximally saturated chromatically.
Yeah, I feel like combining those different phenomena definitely like sort of caused the listener to notice a little bit more than if it was just a gradual transition where you only changed one parameter. When you were using distortion in this album, I know there's lots of places where you've got distorted guitar. Are there certain intervals that you wanted to use in 1710 or certain intervals you avoided? Because obviously it's got that good power chord, like with the fifth and everything. But I'd love to hear more thoughts on how you, not only which intervals you wanted to distort, but how you approached distortion as a general effect.
Yeah, so I think in particular I tried to do a lot of, I don't know what you call them exactly, but the augmented fourth, diminished fifth, those two intervals, because they are so different than anything in 12 EDO and they produce such like a intense beating effect, I thought those are pretty amenable to being distorted. And yeah, and on the opposite extreme, like something like a fifth or a fourth doesn't sound so different than it would in 12 EDO. I also tried to use a few different kind of flavors of distortion, whereas in the past I've done like metal albums where you typically have the exact same distortion sound for the whole album, just about, whereas I went kind of the opposite approach with this one. So the first piece, the one that was reamped by Colin Marston, he used a real thick kind of Marshall-y saturated distortion. Within the energy shapes piece, I intentionally wanted a more kind of gnarly, like digital distortion that doesn't really sound like a typical guitar effect. And then in the Sonata, there's a kind of lighter crunch distortion on the first movement. And then a very thick metal distortion that's a somewhat different flavor than the first track as well. So it's kind of going for variety with distortion rather than the usual homogeneity of metal record.
Yeah, the variety of timbres is really exciting. So, I can really tell you put the effort into tailoring those to each movement.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Are there any scales that you really enjoy using in 17-tone equal temperament, or would you say the approach is mostly chromatic in some sense?
Yeah, it's mostly chromatic. I did have fun playing with the 17-tone version of A minor in that second track. Not so much on this album, but in the past, I've enjoyed putting together like 7 or 8 note scales that have a lot of neutral seconds.
Yes.
And those can end up sounding a bit kind of Macam-esque, I think. So
Yeah.
like there's a piece on the previous 17-tone album, Energetic Bursts, called Chasm, that's more prog rock kind of thing, and it actually does use a fixed scale for the whole piece that has a lot of those neutral seconds in it, and I think has kind of a distinctive sound. All right, so this is the score for Energy Shapes number 3. It's still kind of in progress, so I haven't actually made this public yet. So this is a first look for the podcast, I guess.
Oh, so cool.
Yeah, and you can see I use the ups and downs style of notation to show very visually clearly where you're seeing a single 17 EDO step, and then from there the white notes and the traditional accidentals mean roughly the same thing that they do in 12 EDO. I mean, you run into some exceptions to that, but for the most part it can kind of translate. So I tried to keep things relatively simple in terms of how I notated the electronics. So here it just says clean with repitching stereo delay, and then that's pretty much it for the description of the electronics in the first movement. And then it switches between palm muted and ordinary and solpanticello, playing closer to the bridge, and also some harmonics as well. Once it gets into the movements that have the synthesizer part, then that's when the lower staff starts to be used. So here you can see the effects are on top, so the stereo delay from the previous movement is turned off, and the saturation is turned on with the distortion kind of diminishing over time. And then the rhythms of that kind of white noise percussion thing are notated here as well.
In Oblique, I was kind of hearing the bottom notes as being really important to the arpeggio, like almost hearing like kind of an F sharp neutral tonality oscillating with
Mhm.
an E up tonality.
Yeah, exactly. So it's got this kind of relatively straightforward bass line that these more complicated arpeggios unfold over.
This is so cool that you managed this in Sibelius. I am very much not a. I don't know anything about how to do this in Sibelius, so for those of our listeners who'd like to hack Sibelius to do microtones, do you have any tips for them?
Yeah, so what I had to do was I had to go in and take some of the preset quarter tone intervals, and then I'm forgetting how it works exactly, but there's a setting where you can go and like change which symbol corresponds to which button, basically. And so I swapped in the up and down symbols for I think the quarter tone and quarter flat. So if I was to take this G and tell it to be a quarter tone, it puts an up arrow instead of the quarter tone symbol.
I see. Is there any particular reason that you didn't use the quarter tone symbols themselves, since they're possible in 17 tone equal temperament to use for 1/17th of an octave?
Right. Yeah, I just kind of thought that they made it clear that this wasn't strictly quarter tone music, that they just made it obvious that it's something a little bit different than that. And I also think it makes them easier to distinguish from the regular sharp and flat, because like a quarter sharp doesn't look that different than a regular sharp if you're viewing the page from a distance at all. Whereas
Yeah.
this way it's like really obvious what's a single 17 tone step versus what's two.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. Especially, it also sort of provides a reason for you to not use the sharp with an arrow or the flat with an arrow as well, or a natural with an arrow.
Yeah, I think so.
Does it actually play back in Sibelius for you?
No, it doesn't. Not at all. So
Darn.
this was very much kind of constructed both at the instrument and within the Ableton software, and then the score is kind of a transcription from there.
Right, you have to like reverse engineer it instead of the software really doing it for you.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, maybe if you were using like Dorico or something, you could get it to play back correctly, but within Sibelius, it doesn't. It doesn't understand 17 tone at all.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So and you can see in this section, you finally get some chords coming in within the synthesizer part. I
Yeah.
notated my kind of tempo changes using this type of notation, and we can kind of keep going. So again,
These are really
that's
fascinating chord progressions. I'm trying to. Oh, so you have like F sharp diminished, but not really because one of them is a neutral third. I don't even know what you would call that. I guess I don't know.
yeah, and again, it's something that came from playing the chord on the guitar. So it's something that felt very natural and created a kind of unusual sound that I liked, and that's what it ended up looking like in notation.
With the ergonomic guitar chords that you generally use, is it a situation where you're playing things like diagonal chords, three-fingered chords, and how does the open tuning affect it? I didn't know if you're using standard tuning, but with the 17 tone equivalent or not.
Yeah, I am using standard tuning, and yeah, I think there's. It's been a minute since I played through this, but I think this is all fretted. But there's some other segments where the open strings come in and like make part of the harmony. That was much more the case in the Sonata, where there's like tons of open strings, particularly in the first and last movement.
Yeah, really
But
cool
I
stuff.
think as with any kind of guitar music, if you never use the open strings, you're kind of missing out because there's just like so many kind of chord shapes that can happen with the open strings that you can't really play as fully fretted chords.
Yeah.
So as we move along into the middle, the chop movement is another one that's just guitar and effects without the synthesizer. This one I actually did write away from the instrument. I think I wrote it out like on a piece of paper by hand, and as I recall, I was really trying to like focus on the neutral third interval. And it's also got some really quirky rhythms, and it may not be easy to tell from the recording, but both this movement and desync are based on like repeating chunks of music. So this one page of music repeats 3 times, but it ends up being hard to tell because the effects mangle it so much as it repeats, and also the effects are not always like strictly in rhythm with the guitar. So sometimes there's kind of a polyrhythm between the effects automation curves and what the guitar is doing.
Do you have specific approaches to polyrhythms that involve using effects? I noticed in triads and arpeggios, I really loved how you sort of married the idea of these natural delays that fade away and you made them polyrhythmic. I don't know if that's the trademark of your sound or if you just started it on this album or what inspired that idea.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you like, say you drop two balls on the ground and bounce them, like they're not going to be the exact same volume with each bounce. They'll kind of get quieter and quieter as they also create an interesting rhythm. So I think in terms of like everyday polyrhythms, they do tend to have some kind of shape dynamically. So and that is a trick that I've used a lot to like create some sort of repetitive rhythm, but in order to make it not sound so mechanical, to have like some kind of shape, either gradually getting quieter, gradually getting louder, or maybe like a crossfade kind of effect if the different parts have different contours like that. So in terms of polyrhythms in this piece, so this one I actually kind of wrote it down. So there's the guitar part, which here is just notated spatially. And then the synthesizer is just kind of playing different arpeggios that are based on this chord progression, which actually came from another guitar line later in the piece. And the key thing is that these chunks of material all get repeated 3 times each, roughly, but in different cycles. So the actual guitar part is roughly 45 seconds long, and that gets played 3 times, whereas the change between clean and distortion is about 55 seconds long, and then the chord progression in the synthesizer is about 20 seconds long. So it's kind of a 3-part polyrhythm. It's never going to be, exactly the same twice unless you're just listening to the same recording, but this does mean that it's all not in sync with each other, hence the title. And so it's kind of a way of making something that's constructed in a fairly repetitive way actually constantly change because the relationships keep changing.
So with this sort of non-linear kind of writing, then, I see you have this rigorous chord progression here. Does that mean that the performer needs to be lining up with the chord progression is it in a quasi-specific way, or is it something where any of the notes can work with any of the chords?
Yeah, I think the latter. I mean, it's because it's very chromatic. Like, I don't think anything necessarily sounds wrong against the chords. So probably for the first few gestures, the notes of the melody and the chords are sort of synced up. But then after that, it all just kind of splits apart. And so the relationships will be a little different each time.
And hence the name, we can expect that to be an engineered effect.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Very cool.
And then the final movement is the kind of cartoony one that's back to having more synchronized stuff between the synth and the guitar. And this one also has a kind of funky thirds-based harmony between the guitar and the top synthesizer line. But it also does these evolving effects things, so like even in the synths, I made some notes of like where something fades in or where the like treble versus bass changes a little bit. And then at the end here, so this is actually the same chord progression, I think, as the desync synthesizer part, but on the guitar. And so the guitar repeats this as it becomes less and less distorted, and then the synthesizer starts off with a notated arpeggio, but through a like randomization MIDI plugin, the notes become more and more unpredictable as the synthesizer arpeggios become more prominent.
I see. And those random notes, are those random notes that would fall into the arpeggios themselves, or completely chromatic notes? Like, to what degree is this randomness affecting the arpeggio as it sort of, changes its entropy over time?
Yeah, so it changes it very dramatically. The one caveat is that since this is FM8 and it doesn't really do more than 12 notes at a time, the randomization is happening within a 12-note subset of 17 EDO.
Right. Is that, I guess that's an example of how, like, using a 12-note subset of FM8 can affect your writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the piano part in the second piece on the album is also a 12-note subset. And the reason for that was I wanted it to be relatively playable and to like have the performer be able to look at the score and have some relationship to where their hands are, I like to think it's a slightly more accessible option. It's also more accessible software-wise too, because I think there's more, samplers and synthesizers that can do that kind of microtuning than the ones that can actually do like a full 17-note scale remapping.
Yeah, like 12-tone or 12-note mapping. Yeah, but definitely is common. Like I think even Logic will do that or whatever.
Oh yeah, it's been a while since I've used Logic, but that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about with the album before we bounce?
I mostly just hope people enjoy it, and if they like it and want to dig into my more prog rock side, there's another one called Energetic Bursts that's also for 17-tone guitar, but is much more like oriented around drums and riffs and stuff like that. So, just thanks for listening, and I hope whoever's checking it out finds it meaningful in some way.
Yeah, of course. The album is Oblique by Aaron Myers-Brooks. So yeah, check it out on Bandcamp, and is it on any other sites?
Yeah, it's all over the place. So it's on Spotify and Tidal and Apple Music and basically all the big like streaming and download platforms in addition to Bandcamp. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, of course. Adios.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Now and Zen, everyone. Today's episode featured Aaron Myers-Brooks talking about his album Oblique, a collection of multi-movement pieces as well as some single-movement pieces. The song you're listening to right now is the third movement of Sonata for solo 17-tone guitar, Somber and Deliberate, which is track 11 on the album. He also has some other work that you can check out as well. We have several surprise episodes coming up in the future, so be sure to stay tuned on all of our regular channels. We have YouTube, and we're on the streaming sites, iTunes, Libsyn, all that kind of thing. And we also have a Patreon account where sometimes updates are posted and or updates about other projects regarding microtonal transcription or performance. Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to spread the word among your friends. Thanks to our Zen Harmonic patrons on Patreon, as well as our Zen Harmonic gods, Mike Battaglia, Sheldon Bird, Adam Freese, Matthew Sheeran, Vincenzo Cigarella, Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Joe Weigel, and Tina Harmon Carto. See you next time on Now and Zen.